Hello students. So this is the fifth part of our chapter 2 where I'll be covering field experiments and quasi-experiments, correlational research, coefficient of correlation and types of coefficient of correlation. As you all have already understood what is experimental method, I have already discussed. So today I will explain these parts. Okay? Field experiments and quasi-experiments. So field experiments, by the name itself, I hope you all have understood what does it mean. So suppose if a researcher wants to have high generalizability or to conduct studies which are not possible in laboratory settings, she or he may have to go to the field or the natural setting where the particular phenomenon actually exists, and this is regarded as field experiment. So in field experiments, participants often don't know they're in an experiment, so their behavior may be more natural and similar to a lab experiment, but takes place in a more natural or ordinary setting, and it tends to be a real world setting. For example, in a hospital, a school, or a high street, etc. So here is an example of field experiment given by Bushman 1988, which is the power of uniform. So Bushman conducted this field experiment where a female researcher dressed either in a police style uniform, a business executive, or as a beggar stopped people in the street and told them to give change to a male researcher for an expired parking meter. Okay, so basically in various uniforms, they dressed up in various uniforms and they asked uh, money from people. Okay, so after the field experiment has been conducted, the researchers evaluated the responses, that how many of them obeyed and to which uniform, what type of dress did they obeyed more. So they have found out that when the person was dressed as police uniform, 72% obeyed. Then when dressed as business executive women, only 48% obeyed. And when dressed as beggar, 52% obeyed. Okay, so evaluation of field experiments, what do we find out is that it is high in ecological validity. So more natural settings, so people's behavior is likely to be more natural because they are in a familiar setting living their everyday life. Ethical issues, for example, lack of informed consent, lack of debrief deception, psychological harm, confidentiality, no right to withdraw. There are these ethical issues. Then there is this extraneous variables. That means it is hard to control extraneous variables. For example, in Bushman's study, the weather may have had an effect on giving money for the meter. Okay. And lastly, opportunity sample. Less control of selecting participants. So out of this, only one one part is regarded to be advantageous, and other three parts is the disadvantages of the field experiment. So natural experiment, for example, Christensen and Hubinett in 1993 tested the effect of anxiety on EWD in real bank robberies in Sweden. So the witnesses were either bystanders, that is employee or customer, where there was low anxiety condition, and the victims, that is bank teller, were high anxiety condition. So the two groups are the naturally occurring independent variable. So the interviews were conducted 4 to 5 months after robberies. The dependent variable is the accuracy of their recall. Okay, there is difference between field experiment and uh, natural experiment. That is why I have given you this example so that it becomes easy for you people to understand. Now let us see about field experiment and natural experiment through this small video.
Field experiments and natural experiments. Because a field experiment happens in a natural setting, people think that means natural experiment. But in a field experiment, the experimenter controls the variables, controls the IV and the DV. It's just in a natural setting. In a natural experiment, the experimenter does not control the IV. It is something that has naturally occurred, like a bank robbery, but they do use a dependent variable, in this case, in the bank robbery one, how accurate is their memory, depending on whether they were in a high anxiety or low anxiety condition.
Okay, so accordingly, there is this dependent variable and independent variable which tells the difference between the field experiment and natural experiment. Next, we have quasi-experiments. So many variables cannot be manipulated in the laboratory settings. For example, if you want to study the effect of an earthquake on children who lost their parents, you cannot create this condition artificially in the laboratory. Yes, is it possible to create artificial earthquake? No, it is not possible. So in such situations, the researchers adopts the method of quasi-experimentation. Quasi is a Latin word which means as if. So one have to see that as if, or feel or imagine that as if something is naturally occurring in quasi experiments, the person have to imagine as if. So here in quasi experiments, for example, does prior drug abuse affect concentration? So the participant cannot be randomly allocated to a condition. So either they are a previous drug abuser or not. So similarly, for example, given as that of the effect of an earthquake on children who lost their parents, there what we have to do is that we have to select participants like one who have already been in an earthquake situation, experienced and who lost their parents, and another who was in an earthquake but they did not lose their parents. Their parents were still there. They are alive, that means. So these are the two conditions where can be selected from a quasi experiment. So here in quasi experiment, the independent variable is naturally occurring. We are not manipulating it. Okay. So it can be a natural difference between participants, for example, age, sexuality, dyslexia, or be it the natural calamities, etc. So the independent variable could also involve some kind of behavior or lifestyle factor of the participant. For example, organic diet, smoker, drug taker, exerciser, homeless, etc. So there is no random allocation of participants to conditions. For example, if you wanted to test how age affects EWT, then you couldn't allocate a child to the adult condition because age determines which condition they are allocated to. Okay, and EWT in psychology means eyewitness testimony. Okay, so here let me give another example of quasi experiment. Look over in the screen, you'll see internal and external locus of control on resisting coercion. Now here Hutchinson ST in 1978 tested whether locus of control influenced someone's ability to resist coercion and used a simulated prisoner of war camp situation. So here internal and external locus of control. Internal, that means I control my destiny. External, they control my destiny. Where independent variable, the locus of control, whether it is internal or external. So it is personal attribute of the person. And the dependent variable on the other side, you can see ability to resist coercion from an interrogator to gain information. Okay. So evaluation of quasi experiments, what we find out is that the advantage is opportunity to study ethically sensitive topics. So opportunity to study topics that you could not manipulate in the laboratory for practical or ethical reasons. For example, whether being asylum seeker influences attainment at school or whether sexuality affects self-esteem. Okay. Next, allows comparisons between types of people. Now here test differences in this like age, sex, religion, ability, etc. So basically in quasi experiment it allows comparisons between types of people. Now moving on to certain limitations, that is disadvantages. There is lack of internal validity in quasi experiment. That means uh, it may know they are being studied and display participant reactivity and or demand characteristics. Okay, so basically it has lack of internal validity. Next, there is confounding variables. Lack of control over the independent variable IV means there may be uncontrolled confounding variables which may influence the dependent variable DV. Example, Bothwell et al. 1987 conducted that people high in neuroticism are often prone to worry. Neuroticism are persons who are basically more sensitive towards being stressed, worry. Okay, that is neuroticism. Perhaps this group was worried about giving incorrect information and so did not say everything they recalled. So this confounding variable makes it difficult to ascertain cause and effect. Next, we have correlational research. The correlational method is a research method in which researchers attempt to determine whether and to what extent different variables are related to each other. So for example, whether the amount of study time is related to the student's academic achievement or to the study of the relationship between intelligence and adjustment, where you cannot create people with high or low levels of intelligence or vary their adjustment level. You can just select people with low and high intelligence and assess their levels of adjustment. Okay, so if students missing in the most classes get lower grades, the suggestion is that there is a causal relationship between attendance and overall performance. So basically in correlational research, we just try to compare that whether there is any relation between certain variables or not. Okay. Correlation coefficient under the correlational method. So the strength and direction of the relationship between the two variables is represented by a number which is known as correlation coefficient or coefficient of correlation, and its value can range from plus 1.0 through 0.0 to minus 1.0. I don't know you all have got it or not, but I think in class 10 most probably in statistics you might have got coefficient of correlation. So here certain types of coefficient of correlation we have to go through. With number one, it is positive correlation. Correlation method is very simple to understand, and coefficient of correlation, where we are talking about positive correlation, it indicates that as the value of one variable, for instance x, increases, the value of the other variable y also increase. Similarly, when variable x decreases, a decrease in y too takes place. Okay, for instance, more time the students spend on their study, the higher is their achievement score. Also, the less they study, the lower their achievement score. Similarly, age and height of a child is equal to positive correlation, that is plus 1.0. Okay, so this means that both the variables move in the same direction. Next, we have negative correlation. It tells us that as the value of one variable, x, increases, the value of the other, that is y, decreases. So the variables move in opposite directions over here. For example, as the hours of study time increase, the number of hours spent in other activities will decrease. Likewise, study time and anxiety is equal to negative correlation, that is minus 1.0. And lastly, we have zero correlation. So it is possible that sometimes no correlation may exist between the two variables, and this is called zero correlation. It is difficult to find zero correlation, but the correlations found may be close to zero. For example, minus 0.02 or plus 0.03. For example, eating ice cream and weight loss equal to no correlation. Okay, zero correlation. So the degree of correlation under zero correlation, it means that there is no relation.